How did we let ourselves get $32.9 trillion in debt? The national debt is the amount of money the federal government has borrowed to cover the outstanding balance of expenses incurred over time. The U.S. has had debt since our inception. During the American Revolutionary War, it amounted to about $75 million by 1791. Over the following 45 years, the debt grew. Notably, the public debt actually shrank to zero by January 1835 under President Andrew Jackson. But soon after, it quickly grew into the millions again. The Civil War resulted in dramatic debt growth. The debt was just $65 million in 1860, but passed $1 billion in 1863, and had reached $2.7 billion following the war. The debt grew steadily into the 20th century and was roughly $22 billion as the country paid for involvement in World War I. Throughout World War II, the debt kept growing to a magnitude from $51 billion in 1940 to $260 billion following the war. After this period, the debt's growth closely matched the rate of inflation until the 80s, when it began to increase rapidly. Between 1980 and 1990, the debt more than tripled. The debt shrank briefly after the end of the Cold War, but by the end of 2008, the national debt had reached $10.3 trillion, about 10 times its 1980 level. Since 2008, the debt has grown from $10 trillion to the now $32.9 trillion. So what causes all this debt? Debt occurs when you spend more than you make. Last year, the federal government collected $4.9 trillion in revenue. However, they spent $6.27 trillion. Since the government spent more than they collected, the deficit for 2022 was $1.38 trillion, which means we went $1.38 trillion more in debt. The top 4 things we spent the most money on is the Department of Health and Human Services, which was $1.38 trillion, Social Security Administration, which was $1.17 trillion, Department of Treasury, $965 billion, and military programs, $876 billion. So how do we fix this? As many of you know, the main source of income for the government is through taxes. They still make money in other ways, such as fines and tariffs, but the main way of revenue is through taxes. The answer seems quite simple. We just raise taxes and cut spending. However, there's a problem with both of those. To cut spending, that means we would have to cut government jobs, cut off support to people who rely on the government to stay alive, and or weaken our national security, which none of those sound very viable. However, there are things such as foreign aid that we could cut off and that would save us hundreds of billions of dollars. But that could weaken foreign relations. So the solution is to have our politicians find something that we could cut that would have the least amount of consequences to it. As most of our spending is spent for a good reason, or at least has good reasonings behind it, there are definitely still ways we could cut out spending in the budget. Or we could raise taxes, but I think we could all agree that we are already way too heavily taxed, and no one wants to pay more in taxes.